Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Imperfect Men's Club podcast. My name is Mark Aylward, and I'm here with my friend and colleague Jim Gurley. And I think what we're going to do today is based on some of events in our lives and some conversations Jim had. We came up with this note and a podcast that Jim listened to about a gentleman who was talking about the fact that we look at the world through our own screens, and it rolled into how we use a flywheel in the five areas of life are essentially screens, and we all have these five areas of life. Our screens are different, but the categories of those screens are the same. And I think, just as a reminder, health, relationships, profession, worldview, and money. And money was the one that came up, but I thought we could roll around the wheel, Jim, and say, we all look at money based on, how we were raised, how our parents looked at money, and then circumstances throughout our lives where we maybe had a sense of abundance or a sense of scarcity. And I think you were telling a story about someone who was triggered by the topic, and I think it was the triggering was because this particular individual felt like money was a tool that people used to control other people, which it certainly can be. It's certainly quite common. We see it all the time. But yeah, I thought, my monetary lens really goes back to the fact that both my parents are depression babies. And so they grew up in scarcity. We were not we didn't live a scarce life, but we were very frugal. We had everything that we needed, but extravagance and expensive things were not part of our psyche. And so I'd probably have to sit down with a psychologist to understand how that impacted my money lens, because I have been both abundant and scarce. I made millions of dollars and lost it all in a divorce, and so that changed the lives of my children for some time. That changed my life for some time. I believe that's behind me, but it's certainly easy to see, Jim, isn't it, how a particular one of the five areas can really shape the way you see the world. And that's
Yeah.
just money. That's just starting out with money.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And like you said, it made me appreciate the framework that we created of these five areas of our life. And we refer to them as these different areas, but they're screens. They're our our perspective. What's interesting about the one that we added kind of in the end sometimes is the most emotional and when I experienced, and I'll share the story with you, uh, with some strangers about how the triggers too that come from money. And we've talked about a lot of things, especially over the last week, and close to 70 episodes now. And
Yeah, somewhere there. Yeah.
yeah, and the one that we I realized we don't talk much about is money. And so I'll share this short, with respect to being as private as I can in respect to this. But yeah, went to a function. A friend of mine decided to go have a drink afterwards. We were at a bar downtown, nice place, and we went to the end. So there was three people at the end, and then the L shape, and I sat there. So started talking, and like always, everybody, well, what do you do? And so as I shared in the last episodes, I've become more self uh, of how I answer that question, right? Um,
Hmm.
and part of it's to be transparent. The other part is to get comfortable with these conversations. So I'll say, well, I have a number of different projects, um, and one I do a podcast, other I have these different listing these things. Um, However, are you asking what I do for money, or are you asking what I do?
Hmm.
Because it doesn't always line up.
Right.
And so again, just trying to be friendly and transparent. And then that conversation turns in, and it was great. The person I was speaking to directly responded, well, that's I understand the difference. There is a difference. Tell me about your podcast. So then I started talking about these areas. Friend just happened to enter the conversation. Again, very friendly conversation, very light. But we were talking about the podcast, and her friend left. I think she went to the restroom or something, and then came back into the conversation, and then she heard me talking about money.
Hmm.
And I was so surprised when I apparently she heard me say something obviously completely out of context.
Hmm.
Um, but her friend that I was talking to knew it was in context. So she kind of went, she said, no, that's not at all what he meant. But you saw her entire body language change,
Yeah.
and everything from that point on. And I looked at her friend, and I said, wow, remember I was telling you about money? Money's emotional. What I
Hmm.
appreciated about this person that I just had met, as she really was able to quickly understand these five, let's just say, areas of our life, or these five concepts, right? And
Hmm.
we were talking about that. But the one I just happened to be going through was money, and how money is emotional. And then he broke it down into the two areas that we talk about, right? Scarcity or abundance.
Hmm.
Um, but there is also another layer to this, and that, or another, let's say, screen to this, and that is our worldview, which makes up our heritage.
Hmm.
So they happen to be from Iran, which was, again, it's a beautiful culture, but recently had been to Iran. And so obviously I've met a number of people that, but I always wanted to understand a little bit more about, because most of the Iranians that come here, uh, my experience has been very, very successful, right?
Hmm.
They own businesses, and that's just been my experience, especially in the last 20, 30 years. But she was there for a service. Somebody had passed away, so she had to put her what do they refer to it as?
I think it's called a
The,
hijab, but it's
uh,
a veil. You could just
a
call it a
veil.
veil. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I was interested because I've always wanted to ask somebody, what's behind that? Why? And she was great. I really just really appreciate her, just because she is very Americanized. She's lived here most of her life,
Yeah.
and her reaction was, she shook her head, almost looked with disgust, like it's so wrong, it's so unnecessary. And I said, well, what was behind it? Why do they? She says, she said a lot of things to it, but in general, it was they did not want women to show skin,
Hmm.
because skin could be seen as sexual. So that's one of, I mean, I'm not speaking for the only reason. That's one of many areas. This is my interpretation of it. It could be completely wrong, but skin, this goes back, I'm sure, thousands of years, and as a result, that's one of the reasons, and I'm sure there's other reasons. So
Yeah.
then it started to talk about our our cultural differences, right, based on our worldview, and
Hmm.
and how you see the world, and how some cultures, not some, many, use money as power. So
Yeah.
it's used to control people,
Yeah.
and that's a trigger. So yeah, and then in terms of this podcast that I was listening to, it was all about money, and they were referring to screens. And one of the stories in that was that when he was 13 years old, he his grandfather visited their home, and the grandfather said to his father, he's overhearing this, um, who did you steal from to get this home?
Hmm.
That was the first thing that he said, was, who did you have to steal from to get this home? Again, he's overhearing his father response was, I didn't steal from anybody. I own a business.
Hmm.
And with that money, we help the community, and we do things. And his grandfather said back to his father, you keep telling yourself that. Uh, and that became his screen about money. No surprise. He's a very, very successful financial guy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now he took that. He also spoke to the American dream too, right?
Hmm.
He chose uh, to take the screen that anything is impossible in this country, because that's what he learned from his father, not his grandfather.
Hmm.
And the entire podcast was reframed as these different screens we have in life, and it fits into many other areas of our life, and in our case, these five areas. So
Yeah, yeah, I think the what keeps going on as we talk about this topic further, it's just call it a screen, call it a
mhm,
lens, call it an aperture. It's
mhm,
whatever camera you're looking through, and as you're talking about him owning a business, the entrepreneurship thing popped into my head, and that's the next area we could go to would be profession. And I think, both of us have spent most of our lives working for ourselves,
Hmm.
and that shapes you. That
Hmm.
completely shapes you. And if I had been working for somebody else this whole time, that would have shaped me differently, you
Hmm.
know. And I don't know that either one of them is right or wrong. They aren't, they're
No,
preferences,
no.
because some people should be in business for themselves and some people shouldn't. And
Hmm.
I think the earlier you figure that out, the better. But I did some consulting years back for in an organization called SCORE, and it's an acronym that I can't remember what the acronym stands for. It's
Hmm.
something about retired executives that are helping, people that want to open their own businesses. And there was probably 57 consultants in the rotation, all from different walks of life. But half of them were entrepreneurs, and the other half of them thought they were, but they
Hmm.
were playing with other people's money.
Hmm.
And I got $100 million budget, so I have to do all the same things that you have to do as
Hmm.
running your own business. And I'm like, it's just not the same when you're playing with somebody else's money. It
No,
changes the game entirely in terms of how you make decisions.
yeah,
It also shapes the way you view risk,
yeah.
because people that won't take on risk probably shouldn't be entrepreneurs, because it's a risky
Hmm.
venture.
Yeah.
And then the other side of the coin is that you're working for somebody else, that somehow makes your situation more secure. Now, there's no such thing as job security, but it makes
Hmm.
you think that way.
Yes. Yeah.
It shapes your screen or your lens, and that's the professional side of things.
Yeah. Well, it makes me again back to when we created these 5 areas and we did money, we immediately created two subcategories. And one was a entrepreneur, which is what we are. Again, not that one is all better than the other, right? The world needs everybody, so it's not a judgment
Yeah.
at all. But the second one was being a government worker or a employee, because that's a
Hmm.
very different role. Like, as you just mentioned, that's other people's money. It's not your money, and
Hmm.
and an entrepreneur is different. So, yeah, I thought that was I thought that, but also, these events that happen early on in our life, how it shapes our life and how it creates this lens that we have
Hmm.
that doesn't go away. And yeah, let's just go kind of go around the wheel. What I again, just going back to this conversation, I was so impressed how she was able to understand these 5 concepts, because one of her questions was, well, what's the name of your podcast? And I said, it's the Imperfect Men's Club. And she goes, can women listen to it? And I said, well, of course they could. I mean, it applies to everything in life. And again, she was. I just appreciated how fast she was able to get the concept. She also then the conversation continued on about these different areas and how she was able to add to it
Yeah.
from a woman's perspective,
Hmm.
in some ways that she could go way deeper than we could right away, because she got it. And then that's what I
Yeah.
said. Yeah, that's why it's called the Imperfect Men's Club, because most men aren't self-aware of these things that are going on. And that's what my
And
co-host and I do every week, talk about these things. Yeah.
and how men are generally not encouraged to talk about these things. It's not,
Yep.
we don't, society doesn't support that. Even today, it doesn't support that.
Yep.
And that's a rabbit hole we could go down in the future, I'm sure.
Yeah.
The other thing that comes to mind to kind of contextualize this is that's exactly what this is. It's about self-awareness,
Hmm.
right? You're
It
walking
always.
around with multiple different lenses on your eyes,
Hmm.
based on your childhood, based on your parents, based on your circumstances and experiences. And I think it's beholden of all of us, I would say, to periodically just take a self-awareness 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and say, I'm about to talk to such and such a person or a group of people, and this is a little bit of information about this audience, so I understand who my audience
Hmm.
is. But then I also have to bring to that conversation, where are my predispositions based on my worldview, based on
Hmm.
my upbringing, based on my view of money, based on my view of health or nutrition. All of these areas shape who I am, and to be
Hmm.
conscious of where I'm coming from, I think makes me more effective in communication. And
Yeah.
I don't think you can do too much of that self-awareness, because
No,
that's where it
it
starts.
always comes back to self-awareness. Even though we have close to 30 selves in our library of other selves, right? Self-awareness, self-respect, self-dignity, there's all kinds of them. It always comes back to self-awareness. Another thing I want to throw into this conversation, because I'm a visual thinker, and just recently in the last week or so, uh, I had to change some screens in the house. So there's, you have a window and you have a screen, and the reason is you just sometimes you just don't know that you have a screen on a window, and everything you're looking at uh, is filtered.
Hmm.
It's filtered because, and you don't know what you don't know. If it's in this case, these some of these screens have been on the house for over 20 years,
Hmm.
and I think that it's kind of funny, right? I think there's a lot of people walking around with screens on that they don't even know they have on.
No question. No question. No, no, I
Yeah,
think, I mean, and it's so difficult not to get into some politics of some kind. But I mean, look at the mask situation and the evolution of the mask situation. It's
yeah,
like, if there's still people walking around on their own outside with a mask on, they're looking at the world from a very different screen than I am.
mm-hmm,
Very different, right?
yeah,
And to the extent that I understand conceptually that perhaps they're scared, but I don't understand that fear. And that's because I have a very different screen with regard to that. But we were talking a little bit earlier, that's kind of dabbling in the health space. That's another area of life. But,
mm-hmm,
I look back, I was raised by a mother who was reading Linus Pauling and taking vitamin C in the
mm-hmm.
70s.
That's your health
Yeah.
screen. Yeah,
Yeah, that's my health screen. And we cooked all our meals at home. We had a
mm-hmm,
garden in the back. We were conscious of nutrition
mm-hmm,
before anyone else was. It was not mainstream yet at all.
mm-hmm,
And then we were also all relatively athletically. So exercise was encouraged and
mm-hmm.
nutrition was encouraged and, moving around and breathing and stuff like that. We were even dabbling with meditation way back in that time. So, and I,
Interesting.
I think that definitely formed my view of the medical landscape, which includes the pharmaceutical companies, which includes natural remedies to things, which
Mm-hmm.
includes holistic health and all these
Yeah,
other things. And now, as you know, one of my daughters is
I was
actually
just going to say that, and as a
practicing in that
result,
area, you
yeah,
know?
yeah,
So
yeah.
we
Well,
can't,
we'll stay with this, Mark. So again, back to the generational lens, right? So we know uh, that's a as part of our genetic makeup, and that going on in your case, going all the way back to Ireland or Germany. In my case, going back to uh, Switzerland or Italy and so on. That, but where it also comes into play is our parents, and you mentioned the depression. So my mother and father were born um, right as World War II started.
mhm.
Okay, so that means that they came into a world right when the Great Depression was ending. Does that sound right? Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
right. So, in fact, I saw my mom and my sister last Saturday, and we were watching my sister's grandsons playing football, and I made a comment about the cheap gene because we have a cheap gene in our family, and
Hmm.
it's
Yeah, we did
but
too.
oh, do you? Yeah,
Yeah.
and again, I say that because I used to nobody would ever talk about it before. Now I talk about it all the time because without that cheap gene, yeah, you that's a good gene to have. It can also go too far,
Yeah.
but we definitely have it in our family. But that's also why my father um, invested and saved a lot of money, and and financially is in a place where my mom doesn't have to worry, and my mom also was the same way. So yeah, the the cheap gene is related to money,
Hmm.
is very much part of their world experiences, or how they what was going on in the world at that time,
Yep.
and that plays itself out all the way right into our generation and so on. So
Yeah. Well, I think the other, and as you're talking about your parents and your cultural history, it moves us into another one of the categories, which is relationships, how we deal with other people. And,
yep.
I think that from my experience, I think my lens has definitely been framed by both my mother and my father and how they viewed the world and how they treated each other, how they dealt with the children, how they interacted with their friends. They were modeling the way that they dealt with relationships for all four of us growing up. And then there's also, now that I'm been a father of two girls and a boy, I see that my girls, and I think I would say this if they were here, so I'm not embarrassing anybody. I think they're more inclined to be attracted to someone who's like their father.
Of
And I
course.
think that's a
Yeah.
thing. And
Sure.
I think boys are attracted to women that are like their mother. Now,
Mhm.
none of this stuff is true all the time, but I think
Mhm.
those are definitely, they qualify as screens, you know. I mean, if I told you before, you know, when I first met my girlfriend very early on, the phone rang and she picked it up and she said, "Daddy." And I thought to myself, that's a good sign. This one might be a keeper, you know, because her relationship with her father would definitely reflect on how she treated me or viewed me or whatever. Those screens are everywhere and they're
Mhm.
powerful.
Yeah. You know, a powerful one is, and again, back to self-awareness, but typically you find it happening to people later on in life, is a jaded screen that they see the world very in a jaded way. Everything is seen as negative, and that's sad. It's very sad because there comes a point of no return, right? You can't flip that switch back the other direction if you let it go there.
Yeah, I think and you like the phrase and brought it to my attention a couple of years ago, you know, you get bitter or you get better.
Yep.
And I think that's a conscious choice. I think that's a conscious choice made somewhere in midlife. Probably creeps up on you slowly.
Mhm.
I've just always been conscious or tried to be conscious of the fact that if I sit down and I say, what am I grateful for? It's very easy to make a very long list very quickly. And when I do that, I avoid the bitter choice. You know, I've never been inclined to make the bitter choice. I'm always interested in getting better. I'm always interested in
Mhm.
improving. But
Mhm.
you're right. Once you get jaded, I
That's
don't. It's very few people
yeah.
come back from
Yeah.
that.
And it often starts off with being a victim screen. They're
Yeah.
always have the screen on they're being a victim of some of circumstances or somebody else. Uh, and then that eventually, so those are signs that if you're not self-aware of that, you want to stop that as soon as you can, because if you go in the world as a victim, you will become a victim. What,
Yep. Yep.
yeah. Oh, that's right. Now it's kind of coming back to me that it's one of my other favorite quotes. I used to use it a lot more, but what you try to annihilate, you create.
Mm.
And so this is going back to this conversation was I was talking about money and I was going out of my way to try to not talk about it like in a negative uh, lens,
Hmm.
and it created the exact effect.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about the whole profession area of life. I think is that kind of rounds out our. We can bop back into the others however you'd like, but I think in what we were talking about earlier, being an entrepreneur my whole life, and you being an entrepreneur most of your life as well, that definitely is a screen. That's a lens that, and it's a lens that shapes how we view risk. I
yeah,
think is a primary. You know, I have talked to both my friends and my brothers about this because most of my friends are work for someone else, and my brothers have worked for someone else, and my father worked for the same company for 35 years. That shapes you. It shapes
sure,
you. I remember
sure,
when I told my father I was going to start my own company when I was in my late 20s, and I was working for another company making good money, but I was miserable. And he thought I was insane. He thought I was crazy. He didn't understand it at all. And he's a very bright guy, you know, but it's like, and the shaping thing, the other thing that keeps creeping into my head, because you and I have been talking for so long, is what do you think your life might have been like if you never played football? You know,
yeah,
whole different life, whole different
sure,
life, you
yeah,
know?
yeah,
So,
yeah. I misspoke by the way. I meant to say it created the opposite effect, not the same effect. The opposite result. So yeah, let's move around. So we've covered money and screens. We've talked about health. Um, what's next? Our careers, our profession. What?
yeah, and we were talking about that before we started recording, but just to reiterate, what I just said recently was the difference between how an entrepreneur looks at life and how somebody who works
Yep,
for
that's
someone
right.
else
So
looks at
we've
life.
covered that.
Yeah, yeah,
And
and and the relationships with others, you know, that we touched on that earlier. You had talked a little bit about your grandmother and your grandfather, and someone else's grandmother and grandfather stories, and you know, some of us don't know our grandparents too well. Some of us, many of us don't know our great grandparents, but I've got little tidbits of history going back to my great grandparents, and I see some of their influence in my life growing up as well. I mean, relationships with other people, and I had suggested earlier that I think my daughters look at men through the lens of my behavior, that
Mhm.
might be modeling my behavior. And you can take that relationship thing and go 6 levels deep with it.
Mhm.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
I think,
I'll share a another kind of side story without revealing too much information about a generational lens or screen. Let's again, we often talked about in the 30s or late 20s, 30s, right? As they're coming into their profession or coming into that stage in their life. And there is an incident where I gotta try to be careful not to give too much information, but uh, a company that was a well-known brand was what do you call it? Venture capitalists came in and just sucked it dry, took all the money,
mhm.
didn't pay anybody, and then uh, laid off all the people and screwed all the vendors. And if you're 20 something years old or 30 years old and you're working for that company and you see that happen, how does that not affect your screen the rest of your life?
Mhm.
And that happens a lot more than we realize. Where and again, I guess this is capitalism and what it looks like, but it certainly affects the rest of your life because you don't trust the money, or you don't trust the system and how that turns out. So, and it's
Well,
happening more and more. The venture capitalists, or I think that, am I using the right term, Mark? There's other ways to describe it, but they come in and basically just suck the company dry. They never had intentions to build the company. They buy the stock, they sell it, they take the dividends, and then they leave it and move on. And it works,
yeah, I
right?
mean,
They make a lot of money.
what's interesting about that makes me think, and again, what I did for a living so I watched
Yeah.
people in various stages of what you're describing, right? Like
Have you? Yeah. I'd be interested
companies
to hear about
coming
that.
in and acquisitions, mergers,
Hmm.
venture capitalists. What did Carl Icahn used to be called? He's the guy that blew up TWA, the company my dad spent his whole career with.
Hmm.
Um, there was a phrase for what he did. It was corporate raiders or something like
Yeah,
that.
that's the term I was looking for. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But and so I've seen companies take really good care of people. I've seen companies treat people like shit and
Hmm.
everything in between. And I think it's why I've come to the conclusion for the last few years of my career is I'm just going to help people get prepared for
Hmm.
whatever, because I saw so many times people are like, they feel security. They get to a place in their job where they feel secure. And
Hmm.
that's a false sense of security. That's the
Hmm.
wrong screen, you know? And
Hmm.
I've helped so many people out of binds that I really have kind of gravitated towards helping people not get into them in the first place,
Hmm.
and being in a state of preparedness. But you're right, that's happening more and more. But I think it's always happened. I just don't think it's gotten the press it's gotten lately. I
Uh,
think there's
yeah,
never
this
been.
one's a little close to home, and it happens, especially early on in your career. Then you just don't trust the system. I think as you progress through your career, I think that was my reaction, was like, hey, this is part of becoming an adult. You experience these things. Some things don't make sense. They're not fair. That's just called life. And you learn to accept that and move on. And it does work out in the long run.
Well,
But it's
I think that one of the things that, because you've been telling me for a long time that every time you bump into somebody and the podcast comes up, which happens all the time now,
mm,
you just have a lot of fun explaining it and watching people react to it. And
mm,
I think people appreciate it because, I think we all have, to the beginning of our conversation, we all have these screens. And I think that when you recognize what your screens are, what lenses you're looking at life through, I think something happens where you feel like you have a certain sense of control over these things. Because if I identify that I have a bias toward a particular worldview or a particular view of the medical healthcare system or the pharmaceutical companies or
Mhm.
professional sports. Just pick an entity, you know,
Mhm.
and then I have an awareness in my communication that keeps that in perspective. So I think I'm much more effective when I do that. And I think that, a lesson learned would be remind yourself, you're looking at the world in a unique way
Yeah.
based on all these things we just talked about.
Yeah.
And I think if you remind yourself of that before engaging someone in conversation, particularly someone you don't know, it's going to be a better conversation. It's going to be more impactful. It's going to be more beneficial for both of you. So I think I
Yeah.
keep the whole thing we just talked about in the context of self-awareness, because I think that's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Which actually reminds me of two things that happened in relation to what you just said. And that was, we had just finished the episode of Amor Fati, right? I mean, yeah, the fate of the love of fate, and then
Mhm.
that turned into things happen for you, not to you, and it's like you said, how I was able to use that in conversations, in a humorous way, but in also a way that it was the right timing for those people, and yeah, it made me feel. Yeah, it feels good to know that you're having an impact. These conversations that we're having, uh, they go beyond just the podcast, right? People
Yeah.
start using those things, and they're simple terms and they're simple concepts, but they apply to everyday life. And it's yeah, it's a good way to wrap up today's episode of people are listening and they seem to be enjoying it. So let's just keep doing our thing, Mark.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to the next one. I think we're getting a lot more comfortable with this, and I think that we're just going to continue to have an impact. And the feedback we've gotten so far, like you said, some of it's quite touching.
Yeah,
It's pretty
well,
cool.
so
Thanks, Jim.
all right, till next week. Yeah.
See you.